There is a certain kind of silence that only exists at 2 in the morning, in the darkest, most forgotten parts of the city. It's a heavy, suffocating silence, broken only by the sound of relentless rain hitting the pavement and the distant, wailing sirens that never seem to come close enough to actually help anyone. Elias Thorne knew this silence intimately. At 24 years old, he was the only doctor working the graveyard shift at a rundown, underfunded community clinic in the Narrows, a district where the police didn't bother to patrol and where the shadows seemed to have eyes. Elias was exhausted. His white coat was wrinkled, his dark hair fell messily over his tired brown eyes, and his coffee had gone cold 3 hours ago. But he didn't leave. He never left. Because in the Narrows, if Elias didn't stitch up the desperate, the broken, and the bleeding, nobody else would. But before we dive into tonight's story, I want to take a quick second to talk to you guys. If you enjoy these BL storytelling videos and want to support the continuation of this channel, you can join my Patreon, SpicyTimeBL. YouTube does not always make it easy to monetize this kind of content, so Patreon really helps me keep creating these stories for you. You can find the link in the description and the pinned comment. And for those who want the continuation of the videos, bonus scenes, early access, and more uncensored 18+ BL content, SpicyTimeBL is exactly where you can find it. Your support means the absolute world to me. Now, let's get back to the rain-soaked streets of the Narrows. It was 2:14 a.m. when the fragile peace of Elias's clinic was shattered. The heavy glass doors of the entrance were violently kicked open, the glass spider webbing, but miraculously holding together. The freezing night wind howled into the sterile waiting room, bringing with it the metallic smell of blood and the sharp scent of gunpowder. Elias shot up from his desk, his heart slamming against his ribs. 3 men stormed into the clinic. They weren't the usual street thugs Elias treated for knife wounds. These men wore tailored suits completely soaked in rain and blood. They moved with a terrifying, disciplined urgency, and in the center of them, being supported by 2 massive bodyguards, was a man who commanded the room before he even took a breath. "Doctor!" one of the guards roared, pulling a heavy, matte black handgun from his coat and aiming it directly at Elias's chest. "You are going to save him, right now, or you die." Elias froze, his hands instinctively going up, but his eyes didn't look at the gun. They drifted to the man bleeding out between the 2 guards. He was older than Elias, perhaps in his early 30s. He wore a 3-piece charcoal suit that was currently turning a terrifying shade of crimson at the side of his abdomen. He had jet black hair slicked back by the rain, a sharp, aristocratic jawline, and a presence that felt like a suffocating gravity. Even pale, even bleeding onto the linoleum floor, the man looked incredibly dangerous. But what struck Elias the most were the man's eyes. Despite the agonizing pain he must have been in, the man's dark, piercing gaze locked onto Elias. There was no panic in those eyes, no fear of death, only a cold, absolute calculation. "Put the gun away, Marco," the bleeding man whispered. His voice was deep, raspy, and sent an involuntary shiver down Elias's spine. "You're scaring the doctor. Boss, you're bleeding out." "I said," the man murmured, his eyes never leaving Elias's. "Put it away." The guard hesitated, then lowered the weapon. Elias swallowed hard, forcing his medical training to override his terror. He didn't know who this man was, but he knew death when he saw it hovering over someone, and Elias hated death. "Get him on the trauma table," Elias ordered, his voice surprisingly steady. "Now." The next 2 hours were a blur of adrenaline, blood, and the harsh glare of surgical lights. Elias worked with a desperate, frantic precision. He cut away the expensive fabric of the man's shirt, cleaned the entry and exit wounds of the bullet that had narrowly missed the man's liver, and began the arduous process of stopping the bleeding and stitching him up. Throughout the entire procedure, the man refused anesthesia. "I need to stay awake," he had gritted out, his knuckles turning white as he gripped the edges of the steel table. Elias had argued, but one look at the 2 armed guards standing like statues in the corner made him bite his tongue. Instead, Elias worked quickly. As he stitched the wound, he couldn't help but notice the scars littering the man's incredibly toned chest and stomach. Bullet wounds, knife slashes. This man was a warrior, a survivor of a very dark, very violent world. At one point, the pain must have been blinding. The man let out a low, guttural groan, his head falling back against the table. Without thinking, Elias reached up with a blood-stained, gloved hand and gently pressed it against the man's forehead. "Breathe," Elias whispered, his voice soft, dropping the clinical tone. "Just breathe. I've got you. I'm almost done. You're going to be okay." The man's chest heaved, and he slowly opened his eyes. He looked up at Elias, staring at the gentle hand on his forehead, and then up into Elias's soft, worried brown eyes. For a long, stretched-out moment, the chaos of the room faded. There was only the harsh breathing of the wounded man, the hum of the fluorescent lights, and the intense, almost magnetic eye contact between them. The man stared at Elias, as if he had just seen an angel descend into hell. "What is your name?" the man breathed out, his voice a low rumble. "Elias," he replied softly, finishing the final stitch. "Elias Thorne." The man closed his eyes, a faint ghost of a smirk touching his pale lips. "Elias, I am Julian Rossi." Elias's blood ran cold. He stopped moving. Even the guards in the corner seemed to tense. Julian Rossi, the Viper. He was the undisputed head of the Rossi syndicate, the most ruthless, powerful, and terrifying mafia family on this side of the coast. He was a myth, a ghost, a monster whispered about in dark alleys, and Elias had just had his hand gently resting on the man's forehead. Julian opened his eyes again, catching the flash of realization and fear in Elias's expression. "Don't stop now, doctor," Julian murmured softly. "You are doing so well." By the time the sun began to peek over the filthy skyline of the Narrows, Julian's men were carrying their boss out the back door to a waiting armored SUV. Before they left, the guard named Marco tossed a thick manila envelope onto Elias's bloody desk. Elias didn't open it until they were gone. When he did, he found stacks of crisp $100 bills, enough money to keep the clinic running for 5 years, and resting on top of the money was a heavy, embossed black business card with a single silver serpent on it, and a phone number. Nothing else. For the next 2 weeks, Elias's life returned to normal, or, at least, a strange version of normal. He still worked the night shift. He still drank cold coffee. He still treated the broken and the bruised. But things had changed. The local gangs that used to harass his patients suddenly vanished. The graffiti on the clinic walls was painted over in the middle of the night. Whenever Elias walked to his bus stop at 4 a.m., he noticed a sleek, unmarked black car idling half a block away, its headlights off, quietly tailing him until he safely got on the bus. He was being watched. He was being protected. It made Elias furious. He didn't want to owe a mafia boss. He didn't want to be a pet project for a criminal. His frustration boiled over on a rainy Tuesday night. The clinic was empty. Elias was sitting at his desk, rubbing his tired eyes, when the front door chimed. He looked up, ready to tell whoever it was that visiting hours were over. But the words died in his throat. Standing in the doorway, perfectly healed, wearing an immaculately tailored midnight blue suit, was Julian Rossi. He looked dangerous. He looked powerful. And he looked breathtakingly handsome. Without the blood and the pallor of near death, Julian's presence was overwhelming. He walked into the clinic with the slow, deliberate grace of an apex predator. He didn't bring his guards inside. He came alone. Julian stopped in front of Elias's desk, looking down at the young doctor with those dark, unreadable eyes. "You look tired, Elias," Julian said. His voice was smooth as velvet, but it carried an undeniable weight. Elias stood up, crossing his arms over his chest, trying to look intimidating. "It didn't work. What are you doing here, Mr. Rossi? Your stitches don't need to come out for another few days, and even then I assume you have private doctors for that." Julian's lips twitched upward. He reached into his coat and pulled out the manila envelope full of money. He dropped it on the desk. "You tried to return this. You mailed it to a front company of mine." "I don't accept blood money," Elias said stubbornly, lifting his chin. "I'm a doctor. I treat anyone who comes through those doors. You don't owe me, and I certainly don't want to owe you." Julian leaned forward, planting both hands on the edge of Elias's desk. He leaned in so close that Elias could smell his cologne, a rich, intoxicating blend of cedarwood, expensive tobacco, and rain. Elias's breath hitched, but he refused to step back. "It's not blood money, Elias. It's a donation to a dilapidated clinic that desperately needs an MRI machine," Julian said softly, his eyes dropping briefly to Elias's lips before meeting his gaze again. "And as for owing me, Nobody owes the Viper. They just belong to him. But you are different. You saved my life with a gun to your chest, and you didn't even flinch." "I flinched internally," Elias muttered. Julian let out a low, genuine chuckle. The sound was incredibly warm, completely contrasting the terrifying reputation of the man. "Keep the money, Elias. Let my men keep the streets safe for you. It brings me peace of mind. Knowing the man with the gentle hands is safe." Before Elias could argue, Julian reached out. Elias froze as Julian's large, warm, calloused fingers gently brushed a stray lock of hair away from Elias's forehead. The touch was so tender, so incredibly intimate, that Elias felt a jolt of electricity shoot straight to his heart. Julian's eyes lingered on Elias's face for a moment longer, full of a quiet, burning intensity. Then, he stepped back, buttoned his suit jacket, and walked out into the rain, leaving Elias standing there, his heart pounding like a drum in his chest. From that night on, the invisible line between them began to blur. Julian started visiting the clinic, never during the busy hours, always after midnight, when the world was quiet. Sometimes he would bring expensive takeout from restaurants that definitely didn't deliver to the Narrows. Sometimes he would just sit in the corner chair of Elias's office, reading a book or reviewing documents, simply existing in the same space as Elias. Elias told himself he hated it. He told himself it was dangerous. Julian was a criminal, a man who dealt in violence. But Elias couldn't deny the strange comfort he felt when Julian was there. He couldn't deny how his eyes would wander to the broad spread of Julian's shoulders, or how he caught Julian staring at him with a look of such intense longing that it made Elias breathless. They talked. Deep into the night, Julian learned about Elias's childhood, his struggle through medical school, his desperate desire to help people who had no one else. And Elias learned about Julian. He learned that Julian hadn't chosen the Mafia life. He was born into it, forced to take the throne when his father was murdered. He learned that underneath the terrifying exterior of the Viper, there was a man who carried the crushing weight of 1,000 sins. A man who was deeply, profoundly lonely. And just a small reminder, guys, if you are completely hooked on this slow burn romance and want more story continuations, bonus scenes, early access, and uncensored 18+ BL content, you can support me on SpicyTimeBL. The link is right down there in the description and pinned comment. Your support keeps these stories alive. Now, let's get back to the rising tension. The fragile, quiet bubble they had built around themselves couldn't last. In Julian's world, weakness is blood in the water, and Julian's enemies had noticed that the ruthless Viper was spending an awful lot of time guarding a rundown clinic in the Narrows. It happened on a Friday. Elias was closing up the clinic when 3 vans screeched to a halt outside. Armed men poured out. Not Julian's men. These men wore the colors of the Corso family, a vicious rival syndicate looking to claim territory. They smashed the windows. They dragged Elias out from behind his desk. A massive brute of a man slammed Elias against the wall, a heavy knife pressed against the doctor's throat. "So this is the Viper's little pet," the man sneered, smelling of stale alcohol and sweat. "We're going to send Julian a message. We'll send him your pretty little hands in a box." Elias closed his eyes, his heart hammering in terror. He thought of his patients. He thought of his life. And God help him, he thought of Julian. But before the man could move the blade, the sound of a high-powered engine roaring down the street echoed through the night. Tires squealed. Gunfire erupted outside. The glass of the clinic doors shattered inward as the rival thugs were systematically and violently taken down by precision fire. The man holding Elias hesitated, turning his head toward the door. That was his last mistake. A shadow moved through the doorway faster than Elias could process. It was Julian, but this wasn't the quiet man who brought Elias takeout in the middle of the night. This was the Viper. His face was a mask of absolute terrifying rage. His dark eyes were cold as ice. Julian didn't even use a gun. He grabbed the thug by the back of the neck, slammed him against the wall with bone-shattering force, and disarmed him in a second. The thug crumpled to the floor, unconscious. The silence that followed was deafening. Julian's men secured the perimeter, standing outside in the rain, looking away. Julian stood in the center of the ruined clinic, his chest heaving, his fists clenched, blood on his knuckles. He looked like a demon who had just crawled out of hell to protect his treasure. He slowly turned to look at Elias. Elias was shaking, sliding down the wall, clutching his throat where a tiny, thin line of blood was welling up from the knife's edge. In a heartbeat, the monster vanished. Julian was on his knees in front of Elias, his massive, strong hands hovering over Elias's face, terrified to touch him, terrified he might break him. Elias, Julian's voice cracked. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated panic. The Mafia boss, the man who feared nothing, was trembling. Elias, look at me. Are you hurt? Did they? I'm okay. Elias choked out, tears finally spilling over his eyelashes. The adrenaline was crashing. He leaned forward, unable to hold himself up. Julian caught him. He pulled Elias into his broad chest, wrapping his arms around him so tightly, as if he could shield Elias from the entire world with his own body. Elias buried his face in the crook of Julian's neck, clutching at Julian's suit jacket, sobbing quietly. Julian rested his chin on the top of Elias's head, closing his eyes tightly. I'm so sorry, Julian whispered into Elias's hair, his voice thick with emotion. I brought this to your door. I'm so sorry, my beautiful doctor. Julian pulled back just enough to frame Elias's face with both hands. He used his thumbs to gently wipe away Elias's tears. His dark eyes were filled with a fierce, burning possessiveness. You are not staying here, Julian said, his tone leaving absolutely no room for argument. It's not safe. The Corsos know about you now. You are coming with me. I can't just leave my clinic, Elias stammered, though he didn't pull away from Julian's hands. I will put guards on the clinic. I will buy the whole damn building if I have to, Julian growled softly, leaning his forehead against Elias's. The contact sent a shockwave of heat through Elias's entire body. But you are coming home with me. I will not let anything happen to you. Do you understand me, Elias? Elias looked into those desperate, dark eyes, and he knew he had lost the battle. He was already too deep. He nodded, just once. That night, Elias's world shifted completely. He was taken to Julian's estate, a massive, sprawling, heavily fortified mansion hidden in the hills outside the city. It was beautiful, full of dark wood, marble floors, and priceless art, but it felt like a gilded cage. For the first few days, Elias paced the massive guest bedroom like a caged tiger. He felt out of place. He was a doctor from the slums, and now he was living in a billionaire criminal's fortress. But as the days turned into weeks, a new rhythm developed between them, a slow, agonizingly beautiful burn. Because Elias was confined to the estate for his safety, Julian began spending more time working from home. They had dinner together every night at a ridiculously long mahogany table, though they always ended up sitting right next to each other. They would retreat to Julian's massive library in the evenings. Julian would pour 2 glasses of expensive whiskey, and they would sit in large leather armchairs, talking for hours. Elias began to see the heavy toll Julian's life took on him. He saw the way Julian would rub his temples when his lieutenants brought him bad news. He saw the dark circles under Julian's eyes. One night, around 3 a.m., a thunderstorm rolled over the hills. Thunder shook the glass panes of the mansion. Elias couldn't sleep. He walked down to the kitchen to get a glass of water, wearing only sweatpants and an oversized t-shirt. When he turned the corner, he stopped. Julian was sitting at the kitchen island in the dark. He was wearing silk pajama pants, completely shirtless, a glass of amber liquid in his hand. But he wasn't drinking it. He was staring blankly at the marble counter, his chest rising and falling in shallow, ragged breaths. Elias recognized a panic attack when he saw one. He didn't hesitate. Elias walked slowly into the kitchen, keeping his footsteps soft so he wouldn't startle the man. "Julian?" he whispered. Julian snapped his head up, his eyes wide, wild, and haunted. In the dim light of the storm flashes, Elias could see sweat glistening on Julian's scarred chest. Julian looked lost, trapped in some horrifying memory of blood and betrayal. "Elias," Julian breathed, his voice trembling. You shouldn't see me like this." "Hey," Elias said softly, walking right up to Julian. He didn't care about the danger. He didn't care that this man was a killer. Right now, Julian was just a man drowning in his own mind. Elias stepped between Julian's parted knees, standing incredibly close. He reached out and gently placed both of his hands on the sides of Julian's face. Julian flinched at the contact, then melted into it, closing his eyes and letting out a shaky breath. I'm here, Elias murmured, his thumbs tracing the sharp lines of Julian's cheekbones. You're safe. We're in your house. It's just a storm. Julian let out a broken sound and suddenly wrapped his thick, powerful arms around Elias's waist, pulling the younger man flush against his chest. He buried his face into Elias's stomach, holding onto him like a drowning man holding onto a lifeline. Elias gasped softly at the sudden intimacy, feeling the raw, hard muscle of Julian's chest against him. He slowly ran his fingers through Julian's thick, dark hair, massaging his scalp, letting the quiet rhythm of the rain calm them both down. The things I've done, Elias, Julian whispered against him, his voice muffled and full of self-hatred. The blood on my hands. You are so pure. You save lives. I only ruin them. I am a monster, and I am pulling you into the dark with me. Elias's heart broke. He tilted Julian's head up so they were looking eye to eye. You are not a monster to me, Julian, Elias said, his voice fierce and unwavering. You protected me. You saved me. And right now, you're just a man who needs a little healing. Let me heal you. Julian stared up at Elias, his eyes searching Elias's face for any sign of fear, any sign of disgust. He found none. Only a deep, profound affection that terrified Julian more than any bullet ever could. Slowly, hesitantly, Julian reached up and wrapped his large hand around Elias's wrist. He brought Elias's palm to his lips and pressed a lingering, burning kiss against the center of Elias's hand. The romantic tension in the room skyrocketed. It was thick, heavy, and intoxicating. Elias's breath hitched, and he stared down at Julian's lips, feeling an overwhelming urge to lean down and kiss him. But Julian pulled back, his eyes dark and heavy with longing. He wasn't going to push. He respected Elias too much. Thank you, Julian whispered. The next evening, the tension between them was so thick it could be cut with a knife. Every accidental brush of their shoulders, every lingering glance across the hallway, felt like a spark over gasoline. But reality has a way of interrupting perfectly good daydreams. Julian had to attend an underground syndicate gala. It was a neutral ground event where the city's power players met to negotiate. He couldn't skip it without showing weakness to the Corso family. And he absolutely refused to leave Elias at the estate, even with 50 guards. You're coming with me, Julian had said, handing Elias a garment bag. As my private physician, stay calm-side, do not leave my sight. When Elias stepped out of his bedroom that night, he didn't look like a tired clinic doctor anymore. He wore a fitted, sleek, all-black suit that hugged his slender frame perfectly. His hair was styled, and his dark eyes were bright with nervous energy. Julian was waiting at the bottom of the grand staircase. He wore a classic black tuxedo that made him look like a dark prince. When he looked up and saw Elias descending the stairs, Julian actually stopped breathing for a second. His eyes darkened, drinking in every inch of Elias. You look, Julian swallowed hard, stepping forward and offering his arm. Breathtaking. You don't look so bad yourself, Mr. Rossi, Elias teased gently, a slight blush dusting his cheeks as he took Julian's arm. The gala was held in a massive, opulent ballroom in a neutral hotel. It was filled with dangerous people wearing expensive clothes. The moment Julian walked in with Elias on his arm, the room grew quiet. Whispers broke out. The Viper never brought dates. He never brought companions. Elias felt the heavy, predatory stares of 100 criminals on him. He instinctively stepped closer to Julian, their shoulders pressing together. Julian immediately responded, slipping his hand to the small of Elias's back, a possessive, protective weight that sent a clear message to the room. Look, but if you touch, you die. Everything was going smoothly until Julian had to step away for 3 minutes to speak privately with an older mob boss. He left Elias by the bar with 2 massive bodyguards. But bodyguards can't stop social predators. A man approached Elias. He was young, flashy, wearing a ridiculous velvet suit, and he smelled like cheap champagne. He was the son of one of the underbosses. Well, well, the man purred, leaning against the bar, invading Elias's personal space. Julian's new toy. I have to say, you're much prettier than his usual soldiers. What exactly do you do for the Viper, darling? Elias stiffened, his eyes narrowing. I'm his doctor. Now, if you'll excuse me, the man chuckled, reaching out and grabbing Elias's wrist tightly. A doctor? Oh, I have a few aches and pains. Maybe you could give me a private consultation later tonight? I pay much better than Julian. Elias tried to yank his hand away, panic flaring in his chest. Let go of me. Before the bodyguards could even react, a shadow fell over them. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Julian was standing right behind the flashy man. His face was completely devoid of emotion, which was the most terrifying expression he could wear. Let go of his hand, Julian said. His voice wasn't loud, but it cut through the noise of the ballroom like a scythe. The man froze, turning around slowly. The smug smile wiped completely off his face when he saw the absolute murder in Julian's eyes. He immediately dropped Elias's wrist. Viper, we were just talking. Julian didn't look at the man. He looked at Elias, checking him for injuries. When he saw the faint red mark on Elias's wrist, a dark, primal growl vibrated in Julian's chest. Julian grabbed the man by the lapels of his velvet suit, pulling him so close their noses almost touched. If you ever look at him again, if you ever breathe in his direction again, I will cut out your tongue and feed it to my dogs. Do you understand me? The man nodded frantically, his face pale with terror. Julian shoved him away in disgust. He turned to Elias, his expression softening instantly. Without caring who was watching, Julian took Elias's hand, the one that had been grabbed, and gently rubbed the wrist with his thumb. Are you okay? Julian asked softly. I'm fine, Elias breathed, his heart doing backflips in his chest. The sheer, overwhelming protectiveness of this man was intoxicating. Let's go home, Julian. Please. Julian nodded. He wrapped his arm tightly around Elias's waist, and they walked out of the ballroom, leaving a stunned, terrified silence in their wake. The car ride home was tense. The rain had started again, drumming heavily against the armored glass of the SUV. Julian was staring out the window, his jaw clenched so tightly, Elias thought his teeth might break. Julian? Elias ventured softly. I shouldn't have brought you, Julian muttered angrily, still staring out the window. I put you on display. I painted a target on your back. I'm a fool. You don't belong in this filth, Elias. Julian, look at me, Elias said, shifting closer on the leather seat. Julian turned his head, his dark eyes swirling with guilt and frustration. You don't understand, Elias. Every man in that room was calculating how to use you to get to me. You are my weakness now. And in my world, weaknesses are exploited. Then let me go, Elias challenged, though his heart twisted painfully at the words. If I'm a weakness, let me go back to my clinic. Julian flinched, as if he had been physically struck. He turned completely, his large hands reaching out and gripping Elias's shoulders. No, Julian whispered fiercely, his voice cracking. No, I can't. I know I am selfish. I know I am dragging you into hell, but I can't let you go, Elias. I would burn this entire city to the ground before I let anyone take you from me. The raw, desperate confession hung in the air between them. The space between their faces was suddenly practically non-existent. Elias could feel Julian's warm, frantic breaths against his lips. His gaze dropped to Julian's mouth, his own lips parting slightly. Julian groaned, a sound of pure defeat and longing, and leaned in. But before their lips could touch, the world exploded. A massive force slammed into the side of the SUV. The sound of metal crunching and glass shattering was deafening. The car spun wildly out of control on the wet road. Get down! Julian roared. He unbuckled his seatbelt and threw his entire massive body over Elias, shielding the doctor as the SUV rolled over once, twice, before finally crashing into a concrete barrier. Gunfire erupted outside immediately. Rat-tat-tat-tat. Automatic weapons. The Corsos had ambushed them. Elias was dazed, his head ringing. He felt heavy weight on top of him. Julian? He coughed, tasting dust and blood. Julian shifted, letting out a sharp hiss of pain. I'm here. Are you hurt? No, I'm okay, Elias gasped, pushing himself up slightly. He looked down and his heart stopped. There was a piece of twisted metal from the crushed doorframe impaled into Julian's shoulder, right near his collarbone. Blood was soaking through Julian's expensive tuxedo jacket. Julian, you're bleeding! Elias panicked, his medical instincts instantly roaring to life. It's just a scratch, Julian grunted, though his face was pale. He kicked the shattered windshield out with his heavy boot. We have to move, now. Julian's front guards were already returning fire, keeping the Corso hitmen pinned down. Julian grabbed Elias's hand, his grip iron tight despite his injury, and dragged him out of the wreckage. They ran through the pouring rain, ducking behind concrete pillars and abandoned cars as bullets sparked against the pavement around them. Julian used his body as a human shield the entire time, keeping Elias completely covered until Julian's reinforcements arrived, swarming the area with overwhelming firepower. Within minutes, the ambush was neutralized, but the damage was done. Back at the estate, the atmosphere was chaotic. Julian's lieutenants were screaming orders, mobilizing the entire syndicate for war, but Julian ignored them all. He walked straight past his men, gripping his bleeding shoulder, and looked at Elias. "My study. Now," Julian ordered. Elias followed him, grabbing a medical kit from one of the estate doctors on the way. Once they were inside the soundproof study, Julian locked the heavy oak doors, shutting out the chaos of the Mafia world. Julian took off his ruined tuxedo jacket and violently tore open his blood-soaked shirt, sitting heavily in the leather chair. He looked at Elias, expecting the doctor to patch him up, but Elias wasn't moving. Elias stood in the center of the room, staring at the blood on Julian, staring at the man who had just thrown his body over him without a second thought. Elias was shaking, not from the cold rain, but from a profound, earth-shattering realization. He was in love with a mafia boss. He was completely, hopelessly, and terrifyingly in love with Julian Rossi. "Elias?" Julian asked gently, noticing the trembling. "Are you in shock?" "You could have died," Elias whispered, a tear finally escaping and tracking down his pale cheek. "You threw yourself over me. That metal could have gone through your neck, Julian." "It didn't," Julian said simply. "But it could have," Elias suddenly yelled, throwing the medical kit onto the desk. The sound echoed loudly in the quiet room. Elias marched up to Julian, tears streaming freely down his face now. "You think you're invincible? You think you can just take bullets and metal and knives for me? What if I lost you tonight? What if I lost you?" Elias fell to his knees between Julian's legs, grabbing the edges of Julian's unbuttoned shirt, weeping openly. The terror of the crash, the fear of losing this man, it all finally broke the dam inside him. Julian's eyes widened, completely stunned by the emotional outburst. He looked down at the beautiful, brilliant doctor crying over him. Slowly, ignoring the blinding pain in his shoulder, Julian reached out with his good arm. He slipped his hand to the back of Elias's neck and pulled Elias forward, burying Elias's face in his uninjured chest. "Shh, shh, I'm right here," Julian murmured, resting his cheek against the top of Elias's hair. "I'm right here, Elias. I'm not going anywhere." "You can't do that again," Elias sobbed into Julian's skin. "You can't die for me. I wouldn't survive it. I love you too much." The words slipped out before Elias could stop them. He froze, stiffening against Julian's chest. He had said it. He had confessed to the Viper. The room went completely still. Even the storm outside seemed to hold its breath. Julian's hand slowly slid from the back of Elias's neck to cup his jaw. Julian tilted Elias's tear-stained face upward. Julian's dark eyes were wide, filled with an emotion so raw and powerful, it looked like a raging fire. "Say it again," Julian commanded, his voice a hoarse, desperate whisper. Elias sniffled, looking deep into those burning eyes. He didn't hide. He didn't run. "I love you. God help me, Julian. I love you." Julian let out a shaky breath that sounded almost like a sob. He leaned forward, closing the distance between them. Their first kiss was not gentle. It was a collision of relief, terror, adrenaline, and months of agonizing slow-burn tension. Julian kissed Elias like a starving man who had finally found sustenance. His lips were hot, demanding, and incredibly possessive. Elias gasped against Julian's mouth, instantly melting into the kiss. He reached up, tangling his fingers in Julian's dark, messy hair, kissing him back with just as much desperation. He tasted rain, tears, and the intoxicating flavor of Julian. Julian groaned, his good arm wrapping tightly around Elias's waist, hauling the younger man up from the floor and pulling him onto his lap. Elias straddled Julian's thighs, careful of the wounded shoulder, and cupped Julian's face with both hands, deepening the kiss. It was a kiss that spoke of everything they couldn't say. It was a promise of loyalty, a vow of protection, and an absolute surrender to the forbidden love that had grown in the darkest corners of their lives. When they finally broke apart to breathe, their foreheads rested against each other. Both of them were panting, their chests heaving. Julian looked at Elias, a soft, incredibly rare smile touching his lips. It made him look younger, completely free of the burdens of his criminal empire. "I have loved you," Julian whispered, his thumb stroking Elias's lower lip. "From the very moment I looked up from that bloody table and saw you standing there, utterly fearless." Elias smiled through his tears, letting out a watery laugh. "You were pointing a gun at my chest, Julian." "Details," Julian murmured affectionately, leaning in to press a soft, tender kiss to Elias's nose, then his cheek, and finally lingering softly on his lips once more. "You are mine now, Elias, my doctor, my heart, and I promise you, I will make this world safe for you." Elias rested his head against Julian's uninjured shoulder, feeling the steady, strong heartbeat of the man he loved. He knew the world they lived in was dangerous. He knew there would be more battles, more enemies, more blood. But as Julian held him tightly in the quiet safety of the study, Elias knew he wouldn't trade this for anything. He had tamed the monster, and the monster loved him back. And that, my friends, is where we will end tonight's story. Thank you so much for listening. I really hope you enjoyed this slow-burn, dramatic mafia romance. There is something just so powerful about two people from completely different worlds finding a home in each other. Before you go, I want to give a massive thank you to everyone who supports the channel. If you loved this story and want to hear what happens next between Julian and Elias, or if you want access to bonus scenes, early releases, and much more uncensored 18+ BL content, I highly encourage you to join my Patreon, SpicyTimeBL. Your support over there is what allows me to keep writing, editing, and narrating these stories for you here on YouTube. You can find the link to SpicyTimeBL in the description box below and in the pinned comment. Come join the community, get access to the spicy stuff, and help keep the BL stories flowing. Until next time, stay safe, stay romantic, and I'll see you in the next story.